The stories contained in this podcast are the recollections of the guests we've invited onto the show. We are merely an outlet for people to share their truths, and we accept no legal responsibility for the stories contained herein.
I'm Kendra Sheets.
And I'm Rich Gill.
And this is Enough, a podcast which aims to shine light into the darkened corners of the music industry while discussing the ways we can and should improve ourselves and, in turn, our community.
Content warning. This podcast may contain frank and graphic descriptions of sexual abuse and assault, including instances of rape. These accounts can be triggering, specifically for those who have also experienced trauma, especially of a sexual nature.
If at any point during this podcast you feel yourself getting triggered, we suggest taking a break and taking care of yourself before continuing. But we do ask that you continue. These conversations are mentally taxing, but they are so important to have. Thank you. Welcome back to the Enough podcast. I am one of your hosts, Kendra.
And I'm Rich Gill.
We have our guest today. His name is Will. Would you like to introduce yourself, Will, and give us a little background about your history in the music scene, what brought you to music?
Sure. I'll keep it simple. My name is Will Kenneth. I've been a contributor to Razorcake fanzine since 2018, and I'm a survivor of domestic abuse.
Can you talk a little bit about how that happened, how you came to punk rock, sort of got into sort of family of punk rock?
I think I got into it like a lot of people. You know, I saw Green Day on TV, on MTV, and I was like, oh, this is cool. I like this. The first CD I ever bought with my own money was Rancid, Out Come the Wolves.
And a classic.
It's so good. I haven't listened to that album in a long time, but every time I do go back to it, I'm like, wow, this is such a great album. And I don't think I could have appreciated how good it was then. But, you know, from there, I kind of went a little deeper. I think, you know, maybe not everyone went as deep as I did. You know, I pulled out the Epitaph mail order catalog and I was like, Bad Religion, what's this? I want to check this out. Oh, this is the best album from 1988 by Flip Side and says Maximum Rock and Roll magazine. I got to check those out too. Let me go find those. And so I went and sought out and found a copy of Maximum Rock and Roll magazine and started a lifelong obsession with zines and punk zines, and specifically.
There's just something about like getting that zine in your hand, whether it's music based or it's like something that you picked up at a show that someone's put together, you know, on their printer from work or even at like a FedEx Kinko's. Like it just has that feeling of like it holds something that's like what secret do you have that I'm going to find out about as soon as I like what amazing thing is inside of you. And then you find it and you're like, oh, that's why I paid $4 for you.
Zines are interesting in that, like, they're a kind of thing that exists in the moment, and it's hard to get your hands on them again. So if you don't find like issue 1 or 2, what are the odds you're going to ever see that again of like a small print run of like 50? So they're really special. When you get like a cool zine, you're like, oh man, this is like mine. And then, you know, it's also a very personal experience because someone's talking about things that they experienced in their life probably, or interests of theirs that they love. So, you know, you feel like this connection with the person who made it too.
And I think it's interesting because it's something personal that someone went through. Comet Bus is probably like the best example of, I guess, sort of like a diary zine, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of smaller, even just like fold over 4-page zines that people have done. If you didn't get the first time they were around, they were just kind of lost.
Yeah, absolutely. For me personally, I did a zine when I was a teenager. If you ever find a copy.
If you have one, I'll take one.
No, if you ever find one, destroy it. I will pay you money to film it and set it on fire.
Oh my God.
Like, get rid of it.
I feel like that's sort of like how a lot of people feel about their first album. Like, oh, the first thing I ever recorded, get rid of that, please. I want to erase that from existence.
Well, Rich, you brought up Comet Bus. That's a great example of bringing it back into like punk and kind of the community that we all have and share. It's cool, like, because with something like Comet Bus, which is fairly well known, right? We all nodded profusely when you brought it up. We're like, oh yeah. It's one of those things where it's kind of like, it's big, but it's also small, right? Like kind of like how our scene is. We have these big name bands. To us, they're huge. But like they also know your name and they'll buy you a drink at the bar. It's kind of like you can write in, Aaron Comet Bus will write you back. You establish a relationship. We had spoken to Will in advance of this, and Will, you made a really great comment, which is there's no heroes in punk rock. There's no hierarchy. And I think that's such a wonderful way to define kind of where we are or should be in theory with like compared to some of the other music scenes out there is like we can all kind of, link arm in arm, shoulder over shoulder and sing along to the gang vocals at like a festival with like somebody who put out one of your favorite albums. They're standing right next to you. And that is just so inherently different than some of the other experiences that my other friends have that are involved in other types of music.
Yeah, for sure. And to actually finish the quote that my friend said to me, and because I'm stealing her quote, which is,
oh, I bastardized the quote. Oh, no.
No, that's okay. I bastardized it too. So I'm going to actually correct myself. So I have the chance here to like fix it, make it right. So I'm
all
right.
Right.
And so what she said to me was, there are no heroes in punk. They're just friends we haven't made yet. That goes back to what you're saying. It's like, guys like Aaron Comet Bus or some of the other bands that we see at the shows, we can go up and talk to them. We can go see one of our favorite bands together and they'll be standing right next to us singing along. And it does go back to there being no hierarchy in punk in that we're all the same. We're all equals. We're all standing on the same ground. It's the same reason why some bands don't even want to play on stages. They don't want to play bars that have like, light show and all that shit because they don't want to be standing above another person.
And you didn't only get involved in the punk scene in your later teens. You were actually involved in Gainesville, Florida, like the epitome of like the punk scene. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like growing up in that kind of culture?
Gainesville's a cool town. It is a very unique city in that people who come to visit would compare it to like Seattle. Like it just had this vibe of a good, strong community vibe, a lot of connectivity between all the people there. Everybody knew everybody. And it was kind of incestuous in that way. You try to date someone and they've dated like 3 of your best friends already, which is both good and bad. It's a small music scene and not unlike other small music scenes, but there's just something special about Gainesville in that everything is very accessible. Like all of the venues are very close by. You'd walk into any venue and like all the people in there were all in their own bands or starting their own bands or doing something interesting with their lives.
So to kind of bring it on back to why you're here with us, you mentioned that you're a survivor of abuse. Can you give us the background on why you're here, what you're here to talk about, and the recovery process in which you've undergone?
Yeah, sure. So I didn't realize I was subject to verbal and emotional abuse for most of my life. And I actually didn't figure this out until I was into my 30s, really. The way I figured it out, I was at work and scrolling through Facebook, and a friend of mine shared an article titled 9 Signs You Have a Toxic Parent. And I thought, yeah, this should be good, right? Well, shit, I went through the whole thing and my dad checked all 9 signs. That article still exists today, but it's now called like 7 Signs of a Toxic Parent. And like they've changed the whole thing. So I have no idea what I read. But in that moment, I felt validation like, oh, my dad isn't just an asshole, he's abusive. And then I don't know how to describe what happened, but like I just felt this like wave of like trauma just like wash over me. In that moment, I was re-examining my entire life through this lens of abuse. And it was wild to think that like my agency had kind of been taken from me. And one of the things that I had read also is like people who had been raised by certain kinds of emotionally mature parents lack certain skill sets that others have. And I was just like, oh shit, what the fuck? So I did a little more reading. And what I came across was the phrase toxic narcissism, which is kind of a funny phrase because it's like saying ATM machine. Like you wouldn't say automated teller machine.
Right.
The toxicity is kind of implied when you're dealing with a narcissist. So I kind of went deep on the internet reading about narcissism. And what I found was kind of interesting because I didn't know what a narcissist was. And at a very high level, the best way to describe my father is that he's Donald Trump. He's got a thick New York accent. He's completely piece of shit sometimes, like Donald Trump is. And it's not that my father is completely irredeemable. He is a narcissist. So to get to what I was saying, what a narcissist is, when we see narcissists depicted on TV or in movies, we see somebody who is checking themselves out in the mirror. They're obsessed with fashion and they're always talking about things that are of interest only to themselves. But only part of that is true. A real narcissist, as it turns out, is someone who doesn't have this huge ego. The reason why they talk about themselves is because they have zero self-esteem. They are incredibly insecure, and they talk about themselves because they feed off admiration. So they feel like talking about themselves and their accomplishments all the time, and that's the focus of a lot of their conversations, is because it makes them feel better about themselves when they're around people who intimidate them. And, one of the sure signs of a narcissist is that they really lack empathy for other people, and they'll put others down to make themselves feel better. So, hey, that was me. I got put down by my father plenty as a kid. But probably the most striking thing is that they really lack the ability to look inward and accept blame for things that they've done. So if you go to them and are like, hey, Dad, you really hurt me doing this thing that you did. It was really shitty. They'd be like, it didn't happen. I don't know what you're talking about. And if it did, you deserve it. Fuck you. I don't give a shit. And
like a little bit of gaslighting thrown in there.
Yeah, right. That's exactly what that is. They'll do anything they can to remove themselves from having to take responsibility for something they did.
Which is interesting if you think about it, because they're so consumed with themselves all the time. When it comes down to taking responsibility and they need to be involved, they're like, I'm not going to be involved in that. It's like the one thing they don't want to be involved in.
No. And they can't. They don't have the emotional maturity to be able to do that. It's just not something they'll ever be able to do. So if you are trying to talk to a narcissist and be like, hey, I really need an apology from you for what you did, you will probably never get that. And if you do, you have to drag it out of them. And it'll always be a half-assed apology. Like, I'm sorry I did this, but it was for your own good. And for me, it was never worth the effort to get.
There's always going to be some sort of caveat with that.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't realize that, emotional and verbal abuse was abuse. I didn't realize that is something that I was experiencing in my own life. And I didn't realize that I had this person in my life who spent quite a bit of time chipping away at my boundaries and causing serious problems that I had, including deep-seated insecurity and depression. And I didn't realize I was missing critical skill sets, like developing my emotional intelligence. I never had the chance in that household to do that.
It's interesting because with this sort of abuse, we talk about how if someone punches you in the face, you can see a black eye. And with stuff like this, you can't see it. And like you said, sort of in your case, don't even realize that it's happening until sometimes years after the event, or events in this case. And I think that's really good sort of clarification to make about this is just as much abuse as being physically or sexually abused. You just don't see the marks or the scars or things like that.
Exactly. And it's tricky too, like you were saying, because you're in the middle of it. You don't know what's happening. And we don't have to get into the trauma Olympics. We don't have to, compare. I'm not going to tell a sexual abuse survivor that their trauma is worse or not as bad as mine, because shit, it's all terrible at any level. And so, if you're like, man, my father was really controlling, manipulative of me too, but it's not as bad as, just stop right there. As soon as you start comparing yourself to anyone else, you're sort of minimizing what's happening to you in your life. And what I want people to know is that what happened isn't okay, no matter how minor you think it is.
It's not the trauma Olympics.
But all that's to say is get therapy. Therapy is great.
I've been saying for years, even if people don't think they need it, go to therapy.
Yeah, totally agree. I think therapy for me helped me in ways I never expected to help me. Going into therapy, I really needed it. It took me some time to find my person, not because I was bouncing between different therapists, but because I just didn't know where to look. But I got a recommendation from a friend, and I saw someone in this other practice, and worked out really well for me. Before I went to therapy, I really struggled with the knowledge I had that I was abused and didn't know what to do with that. Driving home from work, I had trouble focusing on my drive because I kept thinking about my trauma. and processing my trauma. I would do dishes at home after my daughter went to bed, and I would have to stop and take breaks because I was so angry about what happened to me that I would need to calm myself down and soothe myself to get back to doing dishes.
That's a very good sign of how emotional and verbal abuse is just as bad as physical abuse, because you were having legitimate physical reactions to what happened to you.
Yeah, I was struggling. Like, I struggled at work. I struggled with day-to-day simple tasks because I was just so profoundly upset about what I experienced in my life.
Not only does it take over the physical, the aspect you're struggling physically, but it also creeps into those quiet moments. Like you were saying, you were doing the dishes, and then all of a sudden it moves to the front and it's like, oh God, oh, we're going to work through this now. I really don't have time for this. You're kind of on autopilot. You're still functioning, but like the back burner brain kind of moves to the front with some of the issues that you're low key thinking about without even realizing it.
Oh yeah, I definitely spent years not confronting those thoughts and those feelings, and I buried them. And I had some coping mechanisms that I had to deal with a lot of those thoughts too before they became more pronounced when I realized that I was abused. And this is probably the least bad addiction you can have, but I was totally addicted to video games. And I used that to really cope. Like, I knew exactly how long it would take for me to get from my desk at work to my couch to turn on my PlayStation. And I would spend countless hours on those devices, not doing things that I need to be doing. It got to the point where I had to take action and go see a therapist and talk through that stuff.
And just to sort of validate what you just said, sometimes you're just trying to get through the moment that you're in. You played video games. Some people drink, some people shop. Sometimes it's whatever it is to get you through that moment.
Sometimes people watch the entire first season of Real Housewives of Salt Lake City in like less than 2 days because like the pandemic just gets them down, and they just want to see more about Jen Shaw and how she's having a meltdown, and like that's what gets them through. I don't know, just throwing that out there. Just some
Speaking
people.
for a friend.
Yeah, some people I've seen on the internet.
I've heard that some people
Yeah.
do this very specific thing. Validate whatever gets you through that moment.
I think all of us have kind of been there some way with something before where you're not dealing with it. Either that or it's just completely unconscious and you don't know that it's in there. I feel like it kind of gets to that point where like you're pushing it down and you're pushing it down, but then you're putting more stuff in and eventually you can't really push it down anymore because there's no more room. And that's kind of that like breaking point for some people. Like for your situation, you ended up kind of stumbling on this article and it released all of this stuff that kind of filled up that vessel a little bit higher. So you're like, okay, I'm about to drown. I need to go somewhere to get some help to kind of clear all of this out. And that's when I think therapy comes in. I think therapy is fabulous.
You know, I found someone great who really gets me on my first try. And what makes it even cooler is that there are also somebody who were a part of the Gainesville punk scene. I was there in kind of the early aughts, like the early 2000s, and they were there in the early 90s. So like we got to chat about like some cool bands like Spoke and Radon. And she mentioned a bunch of other bands that like I never even heard of and I need to write down and ask her about again next time I meet with her. But
there's a definite personality type. You know, again, there's numerous personality types within the group, but like there's something special about like every person who would want to be in some of the scenarios we put ourselves in like a punk show or like with punk music, with the lyrics, like with all of that. There's just it takes a special type. And the fact that you not only found a therapist that's helpful on like the mental health level, but also found someone who gets you on where you don't have to do the groundwork to be like, here's what my friends and I do on the weekend. Here's what I do. Like, and then they're like, ew, what? Why do you cram yourself into a stinky basement with like 90 other kids and then slam up against each other until nobody can like, you know, move properly? Like, you don't have to give them the background. They're already kind of there.
It's true. I went to a Descendants show in Jacksonville and like she was there too. Like she totally gets it. You know, I got this theory. The people that go to punk shows and participate in the community get there because of some fucked up shit that happened in their lives that led them there. No one goes, buys a Green Day album and says, yeah, I want to know more about this. And then goes and like picks up a bunch of fucking zines to learn more about it, unless there was something wrong. And there's something that they were missing in their lives that they needed more of. And for sure, like I definitely have that support from my friends in Gainesville. I spent a lot of nights swapping stories with my friends about shit that happened to us in our lives. That's the reason why I started writing for Razorcake, really, is for my friends and people like that. Because, I hear stories of my friend who, as a young girl, young teenager, was hopping trains and like traveling around the country. I don't know what happened in her life that led up to that, but like wasn't good. Or hearing stories about how one of my closest friends, his mom would beat him and then his dad did nothing and just watched and let it happen and was just kind of an enabler in that situation. Or, I think of my friends whose parents, weren't necessarily abusive, but they were neglectful and they just weren't around. And they traveled around the fucking world and left their kid at home to deal with their shit on their own. And he had no boundaries. When I reflected on my own experience in my life, I looked around and was like, wow, all my friends came up from like fucked up experiences and it wasn't okay. And I want to tell them what happened to you. It's not okay. And I hope that maybe in writing my column for Razorcake that I could reach them and help them in the same way that I was being helped in realizing that my trauma wasn't okay either.
Can you talk a little about your column and what it's about for those who may not have seen it before?
So the column kind of started because, like I said, I wanted to reach out to people and I wanted to talk about my experience with domestic abuse. I wanted to go through Razorcake because I really love their values, first of all. Those of you who are not familiar with Razorcake's values, it's very similar to the 94 Gilman Street collective values: no homophobia, no racism, no sexism, none of that bullshit. And they've had those values since the day they were founded. It's very important to them and it comes through in everything they do. So I felt like they would be a great place to do that. I didn't really have the confidence to think like, yeah, this super cool fucking punk scene put together by a bunch of rad people are going to want me of all people. Like I haven't written anything in a decade. But my therapist was like, why not? You don't have to be an expert. You can just do it. So I wrote Todd at Razorcake and I was just like, hey, I got this idea. I want to talk about my trauma in the hopes that I might help people and share my story. Are you interested? And they're like, fuck yeah. So, here I am 4 years later, still talking about this stuff off and on. I'd say about 50% of my column is talking about my life experience with dealing with trauma, recovering from trauma, and how it's impacted my life. And so I think it's good. I think you should read it. Go check it out. You can Google my name, Will Kenneth, and you can easily find it on the Razorcake website too. And yeah, I think it's good shit. But you tell me.
Does it come out in the paper zine every single time?
Actually, it's not in the paper zine. It's not in print. It's online, web only. So
that's even better for people to take a look at it. So
yeah, it's great to share. It's kind of hard to share a print zine. I know that some of my other columnist friends are like, man, I wish I could just see people's reactions to, my column online. For the print zine, it just goes out in the world and who knows who sees it. But at least with, online, I can more directly share with people who aren't subscribers, which, has its ups and downs, but it's fine. I still have other stuff that goes in the print zine, but, for the most part, my column is strictly online. It's supposed to get published every 2 months or so, but I kind of dropped off for a bit because I just recently moved to New York City and moving sucks. Like, I do not recommend that. Yeah. And actually, I have a new column coming out beginning of February that actually talks about my move. So again, not all about my trauma. It's not all dealing with some really heavy stuff. Sometimes I just like bullshit about other things going on in my life, like
moving during a pandemic.
Oh my fucking God. Yeah, I'll give you guys a little preview about something that happened. I was really nervous about people coming to my house because you're going to sell a house. You got to fix it first. I'd ask people to wear masks, and a lot of these guys, they're blue collar workers in America. They probably listen to Fox News. They don't give a fuck about coronavirus. So I asked them to pull up their mask, and they're usually pretty cool about it. But I had one guy who wasn't, and I was not prepared for a guy who'd be like, yeah, I'm having a hard time breathing in this thing and I can't do my job unless I have my mask on. And I'm like, fucking get out of my house. So I wrote about that experience and how that didn't go well and how I could have handled it a lot better.
Hindsight.
Yeah, right. But I did use some of my techniques I learned in therapy to handle the situation, and I did not implement them at all. What I should have done is taken a deep breath. Because what taking a deep breath does is that it refocuses your mind. It takes your brain helps get it out of fight or flight mode and brings it back into critical thinking mode, because you really can't do both at the same time. It was natural for me to get upset over this guy who was arguing with me about his mask. But instead of going to get the fuck out of my house, I could have been like, hey, stop, deep breath. Personally, I take a deep breath. Be like, dude, you got to stop. Walk around. You got to put up your mask. I mean, the guy kept arguing with me. So, like, I tried my best. But, like,
sometimes there's no other way around that.
Yeah.
Also,
it's hard. It is hard to implement this stuff in real life. And to kind of go back to something I was saying before, I didn't get the chance to develop these skills for emotional intelligence until I was an adult. So I've had very little time. Most people would normally get to do their entire lives. So I'm still a work in progress. And that's kind of what I was talking about. What were the consequences of me not handling this in an emotionally mature way and then trying to recover after the fact? And basically my wife was kind of the collateral in that, because she kind of came in and swooped in and let the guy finish his job, even though I told him to get the fuck out of my house. And then she was kind of shaken up because seeing another person yell, someone who's she's close with yell, I mean, that was kind of upsetting for her too. So, after she finished up with the guy, which didn't take very long, we went outside and talked through it. And I apologized profusely for losing my cool. Obviously, having someone come and fix her house was very important to her. But in the moment, all I cared was burning that bridge and being done with it.
So you are a parent yourself now. Having gone through all of this, what have you done to not repeat the same things that happened to you, and also making sure that you're supportive of your child and making sure that they feel loved and respected and all of that good stuff?
Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard to ensure you're not continuing that cycle of abuse, because what I found out as an adult, as a parent, is that the techniques that my father used to parent me don't actually work. So part of my abuse, that my father was very controlling and manipulative, as well as verbally abusive. And we can get into that too. But as far as my daughter is concerned, my dad would go-to technique was yelling at me. He wouldn't really belittle me, but he would do things like, why are you like this? Why are you always doing this? In his head, I was the fuck up. I was not the golden child like my other older brother was. His way of relating to me was by assigning me a role in our family, and that was to be the fuck up. And so anytime I did anything wrong, it was, why are you always like this? But, when you're dealing with a 5-year-old, not a teenager, a little different. When you're dealing with a 5-year-old, so a simple thing like getting my daughter to do what she needs to do. Like what my dad would have done would be yell at me until it gets done or until I break down crying and eventually do it. For my 5-year-old, I'm learning to be empathetic. Why is she not wanting to wash her hands? Why does she not want to wipe her butt? Even though I'm also freaking out because I hate germs and really need her to wipe her butt as quickly as possible. And it's hard because I'm finding that negative enforcement and doing punishments doesn't really get to what we need to do, like get to bed on time, eat dinner. Whereas, being empathetic and listening to what they need and trying to figure out instead of jumping towards punishment and things don't go exactly right seems to work a lot better. Being empathetic, that is, works better than just yelling and screaming and threatening. I think it's gone a lot better for me once I started switching over to doing that and being more attentive than being the person who's just being stubborn and demanding we do things my way.
It seems like one of the things that you've just really working on utilizing is that kind of being present, because, you have to take a deep breath, kind of ground yourself, realize where you are at the moment. Don't yell at the contractor. Talking to your daughter, take a deep breath, realize what's going on, remove yourself from the instantaneous emotional reaction of what the situation would be, and give yourself a moment to process what's actually happening, who you're talking to, what the scenario might be. So some of those old kind of triggers don't instantaneously get brought up in a scenario that doesn't deserve it anymore.
That's exactly right. That goes to a lot of what I learned in therapy, learning to be empathetic. And it's something that I didn't really know how to do well or do right because, again, of how I was raised. To go back to what we were saying earlier, being really upset about my trauma and not knowing how to deal with that, learning to listen to my emotions instead of burying them for years like I had been doing. was the key to everything. So when I learned to listen to myself, I could listen to others better. And that's when the most amazing thing happened. And that's when I learned to be empathetic. And that's when my relationships with everybody in the world changed dramatically. I was suddenly having fulfilling relationships with my friends and my wife on a level that I couldn't experience before. I didn't have the skills to deal with that. And it's wild. I feel like I've had a new lease on life because I can suddenly listen to somebody talking to me about something they've experienced in their lives and connect on that emotional wavelength that wasn't available to me before. And I'm still just blown away by that I've gone through so much of my life not being able to connect with people and struggling with that. And it was a real struggle. It was something that I experienced but couldn't put words to. Like I would hurt my friends. I would do something that would drive people away. And I knew I hurt them, but I didn't understand why. And now I do. And it's because I couldn't listen to their needs. And the same thing with my wife. Sometimes I would upset her and I couldn't it was hard for me to grasp how I was hurting her, but now I can. And it's made having a relationship with someone that I love so much easier and so much more amazing.
It's cool. It sounds like you started seeing in color.
It really did. I knew therapy would be challenging, but it really was hard. But it was worthwhile. It's good pain. It's good hurt.
Can you talk a little bit more in detail on what emotional abuse looked like for you in the scenario in which you were growing up?
Definitely. I think there are really two key components to my father's abuse. One, it was the verbal part, and then there was the manipulation, which was kind of how emotional abuse just kind of worked together on that. If I would do anything wrong or right, just do anything, like it was like walking on eggshells in my house, which resulted in him screaming at me until his face turned red. He would use that anger. He would use his emotions to kind of weaponize his feelings to control and compliance out of me and other folks in my family. But as far as the verbal part goes, I mean, he would insult me constantly. He would constantly be yelling at me, calling me fucking piece of shit. He called me an asshole. He would also really try to tear me down too, in terms of the way I dressed. He would insult my hair constantly. He loved picking on my hair the most, like my sideburns. He'd always comment about something about my body in some way that you really shouldn't have. And those are the kinds of things that really fuck up your self-esteem. But he wouldn't just comment it to me. He would comment it to strangers. Like we'd be at the grocery store. I'd be like, hey, look at my piece of shit son. Isn't he a giant piece of shit? Please laugh with me. This is funny. Teller at the movie theater was another one he did a lot too, but it was mostly like at the grocery store. Like I'd be waiting in line and be like, look at this fucking kid. Can you believe this? And anything that I was interested in, like any of my interests, like video games, comic books, Transformers, any nerd shit that I really loved, it was just met with total condensation, which was also really weird because he would also support every single one of my interests over the years, but still condescend to me about it. Even in recent years, when I've tried to talk to him about something like Game of Thrones, which is the only time he's ever had an interest in something that I also had an interest in. And I tried to talk to him like, Dad, what do you think of the latest episode? I'm all caught up. Like, I want to talk to you about it. He'd be like, this show's stupid and you're stupid for liking it. Fuck this shit. And it's like, oh, why didn't I see that coming? Why would I try to make a connection with my father about a shared interest? The first one we've ever had. And I should have seen that one coming. But yeah, he still does that to this day.
Anything and literally everything you possibly would try, including a thing that he already likes, is still going to bring up that dissent. Like there's nothing you could possibly say that's not going to bring up dissent. You're like, hey, you look nice. He's like, I look like shit. Don't, no. Like, it's just like, nothing is going to work. That's got to be so exhausting and just makes you feel so downtrodden.
It does. And I think it caused me to spend pretty much my entire life thinking like I should be ashamed of the things I like they were beneath me. And it took me a long time to realize, wait a minute, why should I be ashamed that I like Transformers? They're fucking rad. That's why I have a bookshelf full of them, several bookshelves full of them. I love them. So the second half of my dad's abusive tactics were manipulation. He was very, very controlling. He wanted me to be a mini yuppie just like him. And because I wasn't, it gave him a lot of heartburn. And that's where a lot of the abuse as a teenager and even before that came from. But it definitely escalated when I started being more independent as a teen. So, for example, he would try to blow up some of my relationships. There was a girl I dated in high school. One day we were going to go see the Toasters, I think. We were leaving my house and, we're on our way out the door. My dad said something to me and I don't remember what he said because trauma is a funny thing like that. I could probably look up and tell you why your brain in a traumatic situation doesn't remember exact words or sequences exactly perfectly. But when you go into fight or flight mode, your brain doesn't really record memories as well. So my dad starts insulting me and my girlfriend at the time started arguing back with him. Like, you can't treat him that way. That's not okay. I was ready to run out the fucking door as fast as I could. And she just planted her feet down and was just arguing with them. I was in fight or flight, so I was in flight mode. She was in fight mode. It was fucking badass. And he was bright in the face, yelling, screaming at the top of his lungs, I'm sure. And she didn't back down. Anyway, freaked me out, but it was like one of the coolest things anyone has ever done for me in my entire life. And I wish I knew where she was so I can thank her for doing that. So my dad kind of forbade me from seeing her. And the fact that she stood up for me made it hard for him to control me after that. So he had to cut that out. That sucked. I'm not the only person who's done that too. Sometime after my parents separated, he tried to get me to stop talking to my own mother. Like, fuck you, asshole. I'm not going to stop talking to my mom because you told me to. He loves to try to sabotage relationships. In high school, he wouldn't let me join bands. He didn't even want me to join like school band. It was weird. Besides the manipulation, as I got a little bit older, as I became a teenager, left the house, went off to college, my dad would try to control me with money. He wouldn't give me access to my own bank account. And I became dependent on him and by design. And he made it seem like this was a good thing. For other people, like that level of control and manipulation is kind of like someone taking your car keys or taking your driver's license or watching your social media. It's another way that they try to control you outside of the home or inside the home too. It wasn't until a friend of mine pointed out to me like what he was doing and that I'm 20 years old. I don't need to be dependent on my father when he would use the money to be like, no, you can't do this thing. I'm paying for your apartment that you live in. You can't go do this thing I don't want you to do because money. That's when my friend was like, why didn't you just get a loan? And I'm like, shit, why didn't I think of that? That's a great idea.
Sometimes it's good to have that exterior perspective looking in, giving you those couple problem solving pieces that you were missing because you're just so in the thick of it, forest through the trees and all.
Yes, exactly. And honestly, that's why I do what I'm doing for Razorcake, because I want other people to know what happened to me because it might spark that same thing for them to break out of those controlling, manipulative situations. And when other people speak out, it's empowering to talk about your experiences. And they don't want you to empower others too, because silence gives abusers currency to be controlling. So when you learn their techniques, when you learn what they're doing, it gives you and other people a chance to break free of that. So that's a great reason why you should speak out about your experiences. I benefited from other people in the punk scene speaking out about their own experiences. When I was a kid reading Maximum Rock and Roll fanzine, there was a writer, his name was George Tabb, who wrote about his own experiences with domestic abuse. He was sometimes viciously beaten by his own father as a kid who beat him and his brothers growing up. And he would stand up to his dad to protect his brothers, to keep them from taking beatings like he was doing. And so when he wrote about his experiences of standing up to his physically abusive father, it gave me the courage I needed to stand up to my own father as a teenager. And that was some radical shit. Learning that if I stood up to my dad, the world doesn't end. The consequences of arguing with him are not as bad as I might think. And so, I withstood a lot of verbal abuse whenever I stood up to him, but I walked away from those conversations and I was okay. If it wasn't for George Tabb writing about that in Maximum Rock and Roll fanzine for as long as he did, I don't think I would have had as easy as a time as I did dealing with my own father.
One of the things in regards to standing up, speaking out, what it does is it establishes agency for yourself. And that is so threatening to somebody who spends so much of their time trying to take away other people's agency and to control what other people are doing. So if you go against the grain and you do exactly the opposite of what they're trying to get you to do, which is to be suppressed to be submissive. You start to watch their walls start to tumble down. I love to describe it this way, but it's like, it reminds me of every like last scene in every Disney movie, but where like the bad guy, bad woman, bad, witch, whatever it is, turns into like that mega monster at the end, like Little Mermaid, where Ursula gets giant, or like the dragon comes about in Sleeping Beauty. And that final hit, like they lance the person or the monster, whatever, and they're bleeding out. They know they're going to die. They just start flailing on the way down, and you watch them slowly, like, you know what I'm talking about? Like the walls start crumbling in, and they know that they're about to go down. So they're just grabbing at everything they possibly can. And they're just talking shit, and they're trying to fight you because they know that they've lost their sense of power because you've established your own agency. And that is like my favorite moment of not only those movies, but like also real life.
Yeah, that is such a great analogy. And like those Disney movies, those princess movies are like such a great example of people reclaiming their own agency. I relate a lot to those Disney princess characters. That's exactly what I experienced when I was first going through trying to understand my trauma better, was realizing that my agency was stolen from me. I don't know how many of my decisions I've made were influenced by my father trying to control me. I think that's really been a big sticking point in my life the past couple of years, is kind of realizing that some of the experiences that other kids got to have, I didn't have to have, and trying to resolve my grief over that. We don't all come from the same starting point in life. And, I went to like one of the top private schools in the country, but I wasn't on a strong footing for developing emotionally. I think therapy has helped me get back on a good footing and catch up to where the rest of the people are. So it's easy to try to compare yourself to other people who've had it easier or are different than you, but we're not all the same, and comparing yourself to other folks is not going to help you as a person who's experienced trauma, help you move forward in any way. And it's good to kind of look forward. Don't look to what the other person is doing. Stay focused on your recovery and your goals. And your goals are not the same as someone who, had two wonderful and supporting parents like I didn't have. So actually, gratitude to my mom for being supportive of me doing stuff like this podcast or starting my Razorcake home, and me going to therapy and talking about this stuff with her. Credit to my mom for apologizing for not realizing this was happening to me as I was growing up in the same household. So shout out to her. And I'll say that if you're the victim of domestic abuse and raised by a narcissist like I was, don't compare yourself to others who may have had it easier than you in your 20s and 30s and had different life experiences than you.
Enough is a podcast centering on abuse, harassment, and assault in the music scene. To help get the word out, please like or subscribe and share with your friends. If you have been on the receiving end of harm from someone, be it artist, venue owner, audience member, or someone else, and would like to share your story on a future episode, please reach out to us at thisisenoughpodcast@gmail.com. All correspondences are kept confidential.